The silence in the grand synod of the Ethel Guardian hegemony was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of predatory anticipation. High Exarch Vor sat upon the obsidian throne, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the shimmering light of the nebula that swirled beyond the transparent steel dome of the chamber. The air smelled of ozone and crushed lavender, a scent designed to soothe the nerves of lesser species, but for the High Exarch, it was the scent of victory. He tapped a long, chitinous claw against the armrest, the sound echoing sharply across the vast, circular hall where representatives from 1,000 subject systems waited with bated breath. They were not waiting for a declaration of war, nor a decree of execution, but for the punchline of the greatest economic joke in the history of the galaxy. The topic at hand was the Terran Union, a species of soft-skinned, bipedal latecomers who had stumbled out of their gravity well with wide eyes and open wallets, desperate for protection, desperate for legitimacy, and painfully naive about the realities of interstellar commerce. Vor allowed a low, chittering sound to escape his throat, a laugh that rippled through the gathered nobility. The holographic display in the center of the room flared to life, showing a graveyard orbit around a dying star in the fringes of the hegemony's territory. There, floating in the cosmic dust, were the hulks, thousands of them. "Behold," Vor's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the ancient chamber. "The grand fleet of the Terran Union, the pride of Earth, the shield of their fragile little blue marble." A ripple of amusement went through the crowd. On the display, the ships looked like carcasses. They were the discarded remnants of the hegemony's wars from 3,000 cycles ago, the Gorath-class dreadnoughts, the Silex cruisers. They were rusted, their hulls pitted by micrometeoroids, their reactor cores leaked, their weapon mounts stripped of anything valuable. They were radioactive coffins that the hegemony had been preparing to scuttle into the star. Instead, the humans had come. They had come with their heavy metals, their rare isotopes, and their begging diplomacy, asking to purchase naval assets to defend their trade routes from piracy. And Vor, in a stroke of genius that would ensure his legacy, had sold them the scrap. He had sold them the rust. "They paid full price," Vor continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "For ships that cannot jump, for guns that cannot fire, for reactors that are more likely to poison their crews than power their engines. We cleared our waste, and they thanked us for the privilege." The laughter that followed was cruel and dismissive. It was the sound of an empire that had forgotten the taste of fear, an empire that believed its own propaganda of eternal supremacy. Among the crowd, however, sat Ambassador Kalen of the Vex. He was an older creature, his skin the texture of dry parchment, his eyes clouded with the wisdom of a species that had seen empires rise and fall long before the Ethel Guardians climbed out of the mud. Kalen did not laugh. He watched the hologram with a deep, unsettling focus. He had met the humans. He had sat across from their admiral, a man named Vance, whose eyes were like polished flint. Kalen remembered the transaction. He remembered that the humans did not haggle. They did not inspect the engines with the scrutiny of a buyer. They inspected the frames with the reverence of an archaeologist. They had touched the rusted durasteel as if it were holy. Kalen felt a chill crawl up his spine, a sensation he had not felt in centuries. He looked at High Exarch Vor, preening on his throne, and wondered if the Ethel Guardians understood the difference between a scavenger and a builder. "Ambassador Kalen," Vor called out, noticing the Vex's silence. "You seem troubled. Do you mourn for the credits the humans squandered, or do you fear their mighty fleet of ghosts?" The Exarch's sarcasm was thick, drawing snickers from the surrounding courtiers. Kalen slowly stood, his movements fluid and deliberate. He adjusted the ceremonial robes of his station and looked up at the throne. "I mourn nothing, High Exarch," Kalen said, his voice soft but carrying a resonance that cut through the laughter. "But I recall an old proverb from my people's history from before we joined the hegemony. Do not mock the man who buys a broken sword, for he may know how to forge it anew." The humans, they were too quiet when they took possession of the fleet. They towed them away into the deep dark, into the nebulae where our sensors cannot penetrate. It has been 5 cycles. We have heard nothing, no distress calls, no explosions, just silence. Vor waved a dismissive hand. "They are dead, Kalen, or they are drifting in the void, freezing in the dark, realizing they bought a mountain of trash. We stripped the hyperdrives. We removed the targeting logic. They bought metal, nothing more." The Exarch leaned forward, his expression hardening. "And today they return, or rather their diplomatic envoy returns. They requested an audience to discuss terms of updated alliance. Doubtless, they are coming to beg for a refund. They are coming to kneel and ask for our protection, admitting their foolishness. And when they do, we shall broadcast their humiliation to every corner of the galaxy, a warning to any other upstart species that thinks they can sit at the table of giants. As if on cue, the massive doors of the Synod chamber groaned. The deep, resonating thrum of the docking clamps disengaging echoed through the station's superstructure. The sensory feeds on the walls shifted, showing the external view. A single ship had arrived. It was small, sleek, and utilitarian. It was a Terran shuttle, painted in a matte charcoal gray that absorbed the light of the stars. It moved with a precise, mechanical grace, docking at the primary spire. Minutes passed in heavy silence. The air in the chamber grew tense, not with fear, but with the awkward anticipation of a confrontation. The doors parted. There was no fanfare, no trumpets, no retinue of guards, just three figures walking abreast. In the center was Admiral Vance. He wore a uniform of dark gray, unadorned by medals or ribbons, save for a single silver insignia on his collar, a stylized hammer breaking a chain. To his left was a woman with cybernetic implants tracing her temples, her eyes glowing with a faint blue luminescence. To his right, a tall man carrying a heavy metallic case. They walked with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, their boots striking the polished floor in perfect unison. They did not look at the jeering crowds. They did not look at the opulent tapestries. They looked only at Vor. They stopped 10 paces from the throne. They did not bow. They stood, hands clasped behind their backs, radiating a calm that was profoundly out of place in the center of the hegemony's power. "High Exarch," Vance said. His voice was not loud, but it had a timbre that commanded attention. It was the voice of a man who was used to giving orders that resulted in the deaths of millions and accepting the weight of that reality. "We have returned," Vor sneered, leaning back. "We see that, human. You have come in a shuttle. Where is your grand fleet? Did it fall apart in the gravity well? Did the rust finally eat through the hulls?" The courtiers giggled. Vance's expression did not change. He blinked slowly. "The fleet is waiting. We found the purchase to be most illuminating. We are here to renegotiate the terms of our standing in the hegemony. The initial treaty designated us as a client state, a protectorate dependent on your technological largesse. We believe this classification is no longer accurate." Vor laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Inaccurate? You bought our garbage, human. You are scavengers. You have no industry, no warp theory, no kinetic shielding. You are a client because you are weak. If you are here to ask for your credits back, leave now. The sale was final. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware." Vance turned slightly, looking at Kalen, the Vex ambassador, and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned back to Vor. "We do not want a refund, High Exarch. We are satisfied with the transaction. We are here to offer you a chance to surrender." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. The courtiers froze. Vor's eyes widened, his mandibles twitching in confusion and rage. "Surrender," he whispered, the word feeling alien on his tongue. "You threaten the hegemony with what? With the rust we sold you?" Vance motioned to the man with the case. He stepped forward, placed the case on the floor, and opened it. Inside was not a weapon, but a simple, ancient-looking navigational buoy. It began to pulse with a low, rhythmic thrum. "5 cycles ago," Vance began, his voice taking on a storytelling quality, "you sold us 3,000 Gorath-class hulls. You believed them to be dead. You stripped the drives. You stripped the weapons. But you made a critical error, High Exarch. You forgot what those ships were before you let them rot. You looked at the metal and saw scrap. We looked at the metal and saw history. We looked at the molecular structure of the hull plating and realized that the species who built them, your ancestors, knew secrets of metallurgy that you have forgotten in your decadence." Vance took a step forward. "We didn't buy them for the guns, we bought them for the bones, and we didn't just fix them, we cured them." "This is insanity," Vor shouted, standing up. "Guards, seize them, throw this delusionary ape out of the airlock." The elite Praetorian Guard, towering insectoid warriors clad in golden armor, stepped forward, their energy pikes humming. Vance did not flinch. He raised a hand, checking his wrist chrono. "In 10 seconds. Said calmly, the silent destroyer will translate from slip space. I suggest you look out the window." "Kill him," Vor screamed. The guards lunged, but before their pikes could strike, the station shook. It was not a violent shaking, not an explosion. It was a vibration so deep, so fundamental that it was felt in the marrow of every being in the room. The lights flickered and died, replaced instantly by the red emergency strobes. The gravity plating groaned. And then the light outside the dome vanished. The nebula, the stars, the distant sun, everything was blotted out. A shadow had fallen over the station. A shadow so massive it defied comprehension. The sensors on the walls screamed, red lines spiking off the charts. "High Exarch," a technician shouted from the pit below the throne, his voice cracking with terror. Mass reading detected. It's impossible. It's not a fleet. It's one signal. The mass is equivalent to a small moon, but the energy signature, it's cold. It's reading as absolute zero. Through the dome, the darkness moved. Slowly, running lights flickered on tiny pinpricks of blue against a hull of matte black that seemed to drink the light of the universe. It was a ship, but it was a ship built on a scale that shattered the mind. It was a sleek, predatory dagger, miles long, bristling with antennae and weapon ports that glowed with a menacing violet energy. And flanking it, emerging from the cloak of the flagship's shadow, were the Gorath dreadnoughts. But they were not rusted. They were not broken. They had been stripped down to their skeletons and rebuilt with a terrifying, industrial aesthetic. The rust was gone, replaced by layers of ablative armor that shimmered like oil. The missing engines were replaced by massive toroidal drives that pulsed with the same violet light. They moved in perfect synchronization, a swarm of killer wasps surrounding a leviathan. "The Gorath hulls," Vance said, his voice cutting through the panic. "You built them with high-density neutronium alloys. You stopped using that alloy because it was too hard to work with, too expensive. You switched to cheaper composites. We found that the neutronium, when subjected to specific harmonic frequencies, becomes a superconductor for zero-point energy. We didn't need your reactors. The hull itself is the reactor." Vor slumped back onto his throne, his legs giving way. He looked at the fleet. It was the fleet he had sold. The silhouette was unmistakable, but it was evolved. It was a predator that had shed its old skin and emerged as a monster. What have you done?" "We stripped the weakness," Vance said cold. "We applied human engineering. We applied human necessity. You see, High Exarch, humans evolved on a world where resources were scarce. We don't throw things away. We patch, we repurpose, we iterate. You saw trash, we saw a canvas." The woman with the cybernetic implants tapped her temple. The holographic display in the center of the room changed. It showed a tactical plot of the hegemony's home system. A massive fleet of red icons, the hegemony defense armada, was mobilizing, 300 capital ships, the pride of Ethelgard. "Your fleet is intercepting," the woman said, her voice synthesized and melodic. "Time to contact, 30 seconds. "Call them off," Vance said to Vor, "or they will cease to exist." "You are bluffing," Vor whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. 3,000 refitted garbage scows cannot defeat the pride of the core. Fire, I order the fleet to fire." On the screen, the hegemony fleet opened fire. Thousands of plasma torpedoes and antimatter beams streaked toward the human formation. It was enough firepower to glass a continent. The room held its breath. The beams struck the silent destroyer and its escort. And nothing happened. The energy did not splash against shields. It did not detonate against armor. It simply vanished. The violet aura surrounding the human ships flared brighter for a microsecond, absorbing the onslaught. "Kinetic absorption matrix," Vance explained, as if giving a lecture. "We found that the neutronium alloy, when energized, creates a gravity well that pulls energy into a singularity. You are feeding our batteries, High Exarch. Thank you." Then the silent destroyer spoke. It was not a radio transmission. It was a weapon. The massive ship emitted a pulse, a ripple of distortion that traveled through space at the speed of light. It washed over the hegemony fleet. Instantly, the icons on the tactical map turned gray. "Report," Vor screamed. They are dead in the water, High Exarch," the technician sobbed. "Power failure on all decks. Main reactors scrammed. Life support on emergency reserves. The pulse, it drained them. It siphoned the ionization right out of their cores. They are floating bricks." Vance took a step closer to the throne. The guards stepped back, fear overcoming their loyalty. "That ship," Vance pointed to the Leviathan outside, "is the UNS Hephaestus, but our crews call it the Silent Destroyer. It doesn't need to fire a shot to kill you. It just needs to be near you. It is a vampire of energy, and it was built using the raw materials from the useless internal bulkheads of the ships you sold us. You sold us the weapon that would cut your throat." The reality of the situation settled upon the High Synod like a shroud. The hegemony, the masters of the sector for 10,000 years, had been disarmed in less than a minute by a species they had mocked as primitive. The rusted warships were now the jailers of the Empire. The hubris of the Ethelgardians had been their undoing. They had assumed that technological superiority was a straight line, that newer was always better, that old meant useless. They had forgotten that war is not about the tools. It is about the will to use them and the ingenuity to adapt them. Kalen, the Vex ambassador, stepped forward. He looked at Vor, then at Vance. He slowly lowered himself to one knee. It was a gesture of submission, but also of profound respect. The Vex recognized the Terran Union as the apex power of the sector, he stated. One by one, other ambassadors followed. The lizard-like crawl, the ethereal Sions, the heavy-gravity Ogrins, they knelt. They understood power, and they understood that the game had changed. Vor remained on his throne, shaking. "What do you want?" he rasped. "Do you want my head? Do you want the throne?" Vance shook his head. "We don't want your throne, it's too uncomfortable, and we don't want your empire, we have enough trouble managing our own systems." The admiral turned, looking out at the black ships that hung in the void like jagged knives. "We want the archives." Vor blinked. "The archives, the historical databases." "Yes," Vance said. "Specifically, the stellar cartography records from the pre-collapse era, the records you locked away because you thought they were myths." The request was so unexpected that Vor momentarily forgot his fear. "Why? Those are just legends of the outer rim, useless data about dead stars and empty space." Vance's expression darkened. The calm veneer cracked, revealing a deep existential weariness. "Because, High Exarch, we didn't build the silent destroyer to fight you. You are a nuisance, a bureaucratic hurdle. We built this fleet because we found something in the logs of those rusted ships. A lingering sensor echo burned into the navigation buffers of the oldest dreadnought." Vance tapped a command into his wrist console. The main screen changed again. It showed a star map zooming out past the hegemony's borders, past the known galaxy, into the deep, dark void between galaxies. There in the emptiness was a signal. It was faint, but it was structured. It was a pattern, and it was moving. "The ships you sold us were veterans of the Great War," Vance said softly. "You told us they fought the Separatists, but the damage patterns on the hull, they didn't match plasma burns. They were claw marks, scratches from something biological and massive. Your ancestors didn't decommission those ships because they were old. They parked them because they were tainted by an enemy they wanted to forget." A hush fell over the room. The arrogance of the Ethel Guardians evaporated, replaced by a primal dread. They remembered the nursery rhymes, the stories of the hunger that moves. "The echo is getting louder," Vance continued. "It's a hive mind, a biological tide that consumes stars. It's coming back, and your current fleet, your shiny, plastic, energy-dependent fleet, would be eaten alive. The silent destroyer drains energy. It silences the stars. It is the only thing that can hide us or starve them." Vance looked at Vor with pity. "We fixed the rusted ships because they were the only things tough enough to survive what is coming. We encased them in neutronium because we need to fly into the throat of the beast and choke it. We are not here to conquer you, High Exarch. We are here to draft you." The Admiral turned to leave, his boots clicking on the floor. He paused at the door and looked back. "The silent destroyer will remain in orbit. My engineers will begin retrofitting your fleet immediately. You will provide the labor, you will provide the resources, and you will stop painting your ships gold and start plating them in lead." "And if we refuse," Vor whispered. Vance didn't look back. "Then you can explain to the galaxy why you sold its only salvation for a handful of credits." The doors closed. The chamber was silent again, but it was a different silence. It was the silence of a people who realized they had been children playing with toys while the adults were building a fortress against the night. The rusted warships drifted in the dark, their engines humming with the power of dying stars, waiting for the war that would decide the fate of all living things. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the Ethel Guardians knelt, not I. In ceremony, but in prayer. The days that followed the arrival of the Terran fleet were a blur of chaotic restructuring. The High Synod, once a place of slow debates and wine-soaked indolence, was transformed into a command center of frantic activity. Terran engineers, clad in heavy exoskeletons and carrying tools that looked more like weapons, swarmed the orbital shipyards of the hegemony. They were efficient, brutal in their dismantling of Ethel Guardian aesthetics. The gold filigree was stripped away. The decorative spires were cut down. The massive, inefficient luxury quarters of the officer class were gutted to make room for capacitor banks and kinetic shielding generators. To the Ethel Guardians, it was sacrilege. To the humans, it was survival. High Exarch Vor watched from his tower, drinking a glass of nectar that tasted like ash. He watched as a Terran frigate, one of the rusted ones, docked alongside his personal flagship, the Light of Eternity. The human ship was ugly, scarred, and blocky. It looked like a brick flying through space. But as it connected, Vor saw the data streams on his monitor light up. The human ship was uploading upgrade protocols. It was rewriting the Light of Eternity's operating system. It was infecting his ship with human logic. Redundancy, Redundancy, redundancy. The words scrolled across the screen. The Ethel Guardian systems were elegant, designed for optimal flow. The human systems were paranoid, designed to function even if half the ship was gone. Vor realized, with a sinking heart, that the humans assumed half the ship would be gone. Ambassador Kalen of the Vex found Vor in the observation deck. The Vex looked weary but energized. "They are efficient," Kalen noted, watching a team of human welders fusing armor plating onto a delicate sensor array. "They work as if the fire is already at their heels." "They are vandals," Vor muttered. "They are ruining the fleet." "They are hardening it," Kalen corrected. "I spoke with Admiral Vance. He showed me the data from the silent destroyer. The signal from the void, it is not just a fleet. It is a biological frequency. It sings to the metal. It corrupts technology that is too aware. Your AI-driven ships, your sentient targeting computers, they are liabilities. The enemy can subvert them. That is why the humans use analog backups. That is why they like the rust. Dead metal cannot be seduced." Vor looked at the Vex, horror dawning on him. "Our entire fleet is AI-integrated, our neural networks. Our vulnerabilities," Kalen finished. "The humans are lobotomizing our ships, Exarch. They are cutting out the brains so the bodies can keep fighting when the mind plague hits." A siren wailed throughout the station. It was not the standard alarm. It was a low, mournful tone that vibrated the teeth. Vor's personal comms unit chimed. It was Vance. "Hi, Exarch, Ambassador. Report to the war room immediately. The deep-range sensors on the Hephaestus have picked up a precursor wave. It's starting." The war room on the silent destroyer was a stark contrast to the Synod. It was dark, lit only by the blue glow of tactical tables. The air was cold. Cables ran across the floor, thick bundles of data lines connecting the ancient ship to the hegemony's network. Human officers stood shoulder to shoulder with Ethel Guardian tacticians, the tension palpable. The humans smelled of coffee and machine oil. The aliens smelled of fear pheromones. Vance stood at the central table. The holographic projection showed the edge of the galaxy. A cloud of darkness was obscuring the stars. It wasn't a nebula. It was a swarm. Trillions of biological entities, ranging from the size of a fighter craft to the size of a city. They moved as a liquid flowing through the vacuum. "The swarm," Vance said. "We call them the entropics. They eat energy, heat, light, kinetic force. They feed on order." How far?" Vor asked, his voice trembling. "They just crossed the heliopause of the outermost system, the rim colony of Typhon IV. Vance tapped the table. "We have live feed." The screen shifted to a view from an orbital satellite around Typhon IV. The planet was a lush green jewel. The swarm descended upon it like a shroud. There were no explosions, no laser beams, just a rain of black shapes. They fell into the atmosphere, burning and screeching. The clouds turned gray. The green forests turned black. The lights of the cities winked out one by one. "They are draining the planet," the cybernetic woman said. "Atmospheric ionization is dropping to zero. They are sucking the heat out of the core." "We must save them," Vor shouted. "Typhon IV has a population of 2 billion. "We cannot," Vance said, his face a mask of stone. "If we engage them there with the fleet in its current state, we lose everything. We need a choke point. We need to draw them into the nebula where the silent destroyer can use its main weapon effectively." "You would sacrifice 2 billion live." "Ease," Vor demanded, his outrage flaring. "Is this your human ethics? Is this the morality you preach?" Vance turned to Vor, and for the first time, Vor saw the rage behind the Admiral's eyes. It was a cold, disciplined fury. "Do not lecture me on sacrifice, High Exarch. We bought your rusted ships because we knew we would have to stand in the fire. We are sacrificing Typhon IV so that the other 500 worlds in your hegemony survive. We are buying time with blood. It is a currency we are very familiar with. Are you?" Vor fell silent. He looked at the screen. The planet was dying. The swarm was moving on. "The Nebula of Lost Souls," Vance pointed to a swirling mass of orange gas on the map. "It's highly radioactive. Ion storms, gravimetric shear. Your fancy ships couldn't navigate it, but the Gorath hulls, they were built for it. The radiation masks our energy signatures. We hide the fleet inside the nebula. We lure the swarm in. When they are deep in the gas, the silent destroyer activates the siphon." "The siphon?" Kalen asked. "We reverse the polarity of the kinetic absorption matrix," the engineer explained. "Instead of absorbing energy, we pull the vacuum energy out of the space within the nebula. We create a localized zone of absolute entropy. We starve them. We freeze them instantly." "It's a suicide mission," Vor whispered. To be inside the nebula when that happens, the stress on the hulls. That's why we needed the neutronium, Vance said. And that's why we need you to trust us. The fleet moves in 1 hour. The Battle of the Lost Souls was not recorded in the annals of history as a glorious charge. It was recorded as a nightmare. The combined fleet, the sleek black shapes of the Terran Union and the half-refitted, scarred vessels of the hegemony slipped into the churning orange fog of the nebula. The radiation battered the shields. Lightning arced between the ships. Inside the bridge of the silent destroyer, the crew worked in hushed tones. The silence of the ship was its weapon. It ran cold, its reactors dampened, drifting like a ghost. The swarm entered the nebula. They were drawn by a decoy beacon, an old freighter loaded with antimatter, rigged to pulse with the heartbeat of a star. The biological tides surged into the gas, their hunger blinding them to the trap. Wait, Vance whispered. He watched the tactical plot. The red mass of the swarm was engulfing the decoy. Wait for the main tendril. Vor stood in the corner, clutching a railing. He could feel the pressure of the nebula pressing against the hull. The groans of the metal sounded like the screams of the damned. They are all around us, he whispered. Steady, Vance said. The swarm found them. A tendril of the black mass lashed out, striking a hegemony cruiser. The cruiser's shields flared and died. The biological ships latched onto the hull, tearing through the armor. Screams echoed over the comms. Admiral, the tactical officer shouted. The Valiant is gone. They are breaching the perimeter. Not yet, Vance said, his hand hovering over a red key. We need the Queen. We need the central node. A massive shape emerged from the fog. It was a bioship the size of a moon, pulsing with a sickly green light. It was the heart of the swarm. It moved toward the silent destroyer, sensing the immense potential energy within the human flagship. Target locked, the cybernetic officer said. The Queen is within the event horizon. Vance slammed his hand down. Activate the siphon. The silent destroyer did not fire a beam. It did not launch a missile. It inhaled. The violet lights on the hull turned a blinding white. A sound deeper than bass, a sound that was felt rather than heard, rippled through the nebula. The gas of the nebula seemed to freeze. The lightning stopped mid-arc. The temperature in the sector plummeted toward absolute zero. The swarm reacted instantly. The smaller bioships simply ceased to function, their biological processes arrested by the sudden entropy. They turned into statues of frozen flesh. The Queen screamed, a psychic shockwave that hit every crew member with a headache like a hammer blow. It tried to retreat to burn its engines, but there was no energy to burn. The silent destroyer was drinking it all. The kinetic energy of the Queen's thrusters was sucked away, feeding the human ship. The heat of its biological core was drained. The massive bioship grayed, then blackened. It cracked. The vacuum of space, amplified by the siphon, shattered the frozen monster into a billion shards of ice and dead meat. Pulse complete, the officer reported, her voice shaking. Energy banks at 400% capacity. We have to vent, Admiral, or we'll detonate. Vent into the secondary array, Vance ordered. Jump us out now. The fleet, those that survived, engaged their drives. The energy stolen from the dying swarm powered a mass jump. Space twisted, and they were gone, leaving behind a nebula filled with the frozen corpses of a galaxy-ending threat. They rematerialized in the hegemony capital system. The ships were smoking, armor plates buckled, systems fried. But they were alive. Vor fell to his knees on the bridge. He had seen the face of death, and he had seen humanity stare it down and eat it. Weeks later, the repairs were ongoing. The victory was celebrated, but it was a somber affair. The cost had been high. Dozens of ships lost, thousands of dead, but the swarm was broken. The remnants were being hunted down by the newly formed Iron Alliance, a joint task force of Terran and hegemony vessels. Vance stood in the grand Synod Hall once more. The atmosphere was different now. There was no laughter. There was no mockery. The Ethelgardian nobles looked at the humans with a mixture of awe and fear. Vor approached Vance. The High Exarch was no longer wearing his opulent ceremonial robes. He wore a simple, functional uniform modeled after the Terran style. Admiral, Vor said, we have completed the transfer of the archives. Every star chart, every precursor log, it is yours. Thank you, Vance said. I have a question, Vor asked quietly. The siphon, the weapon, you drained the swarm, you filled your capacitors with enough energy to power a sector for 1,000 years. What will you do with it? Vance looked up at the transparent steel dome. The stars looked different now, sharper. "We aren't keeping it," Vance said, "and we aren't using it for weapons." "Then what?" "We are going to use it to send a message," Vance said. He gestured to the screen. The silent destroyer was in high orbit. It was glowing, the excess energy radiating off its hull in waves of aurora light. "The swarm was running from something," Vance said, dropping the final bombshell. "The biological records we pulled from the Queen's corpse. They were terrified. They weren't invading us. They were fleeing." Vor felt the blood drain from his face. "Fleeing from what?" "We don't know," Vance admitted. "But we know where they came from, Andromeda, and we know that whatever scared them is still there." The silent destroyer angled its prow upward, away from the galactic plane. "We are going to fire the stored energy," Vance said. "Not as a beam of destruction, but as a flare, a signal. We are going to light a beacon that can be seen across the intergalactic void." "Why?" Vor whispered. "Why would you draw attention to us?" Vance smiled, a sad, tired smile. "Because hiding doesn't work, Vor. We learned that on Earth. If you hide, the monsters find you in the dark. You have to light a fire. You have to show them that you are here and that you are awake and that you are armed." Vance placed a hand on the Exarch's shoulder. "We are telling whatever is out there that the galaxy is no longer an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's a fortress, and the rusted warships are the walls." The silent destroyer fired. A beam of pure, blinding light shot out into the dark, traveling faster than logic, piercing the blackness between galaxies. It was a challenge. It was a roar. It was humanity, standing on the ramparts of existence, banging its shield and daring the night to come. Vor watched the light fade into the distance. He looked at his hands, claws that had once signed a deal to sell trash to fools. He looked at the human admiral, the scavenger who had become the savior, and he understood. The rust was not decay. It was armor. The silence was not emptiness. It was the breath before the scream. "Long live the Alliance," Vor whispered. "Long live the Alliance," Vance replied. "Now get your engineers. We have work to do. The siphon burned out the main coils, and I'm not paying for the replacements." For the first time in his life, the High Exarch laughed not with cruelty, but with camaraderie. They walked out of the chamber together, leaving the throne empty behind them. The era of kings was over. The era of builders had begun. And in the cold dark of space, the silent destroyer waited, a rusted sentinel watching the endless night, ready to break the silence once again. The months that followed the Beacon event were a period of unprecedented transformation for the galaxy. The Iron Alliance ceased to be a temporary military pact and solidified into a governing body. The aesthetic of the galaxy shifted. The sleek, fragile curves of Guardian architecture began to merge with the brutalist, redundant industrialism of Terra. Shipyards churned out vessels that were ugly, heavy, and practically indestructible. The rust aesthetic became a symbol of status. To have a ship that showed its welds, that bore the scars of micrometeoroids, was to show that one was a survivor. But amidst the reconstruction, a quiet tension brewed within the inner circle of the Alliance. Admiral Vance spent less time in the Senate halls and more time in the deep laboratories of the silent destroyer. The energy pulse sent to Andromeda was not just a flare. It was a scanner, and the data was beginning. G to return. Deep within the bowels of the flagship, in a chamber shielded by layers of lead and magnetic fields, Vance met with Ambassador Kalen and High Exarch Vor. The room was illuminated by a single, massive holographic table displaying the void between the Milky Way and Andromeda. "The Echo is returning," Vance said without preamble. He looked haggard. He hadn't slept in days. "The monsters?" Vor asked, his voice steady. He had grown much since the Battle of the Nebula. He no longer feared the unknown. He prepared for it. "No," Vance said. "Not monsters, something else." He manipulated the display. The signal returned from the flare wasn't biological scatter like the swarm. It was geometric, mathematical. "A structure," Kalen breathed, his Vex eyes widening. "A megastructure." "It's a Dyson swarm," Vance corrected. "But not around a star. It's built around a supermassive black hole at the edge of the Andromeda galaxy, and it's shifting." The data showed the energy readings. The structure was harvesting the rotational energy of the black hole, the Penrose process on a galactic scale, and it was directing that energy. "They saw our flare," Vance said softly, "and they are signaling back." "Is it a threat?" Vor asked. "We decoded the first packet of data an hour ago," Vance said. It's not a threat, it's a schematics file. The hologram shifted to show a blueprint. It was a design for an engine capable of bridging the gap between galaxies in days, not millennia. But the scale, it required a chassis the size of a moon. They aren't invading, Vance realized, the awe evident in his voice. They are inviting us. The swarm, the entropics, they are a plague that affects both galaxies. This civilization, whatever they are, they built a wall. And they just realized there's someone alive on the other side of the infestation. Vor looked at the blueprint. It was impossible. It was madness. It would require the resources of 100 systems. We can't build this, Vor said. We have to, Vance replied. The swarm we fought was just a scout party, a refugee caravan. The main body is still out there. If we don't link up with the Andromedans, we die alone. Vance looked at his former enemies, now his brothers in arms. You sold us rusted warships because you thought we were trash. We proved we could turn trash into treasure. Now we have to turn a galaxy into a bridge. The Admiral smiled, and for the first time it was a smile of pure, unadulterated ambition. I hope you kept the receipt for those dreadnoughts, Exarch, because we're going to need a lot more metal. The scene faded from the war room to the exterior of the silent destroyer. It hung against the backdrop of the Milky Way, a tiny speck of defiant matter against the infinite dark. Around it, thousands of ships, Ethel Guardian, Terran, Vex, Crawl, moved in formation. They were welding, building, expanding. The rusted hulls were the seeds of a new age. The universe was vast, cold, and filled with horrors. But as long as there was metal to forge and a will to break the silence, humanity and its allies would not go quietly into the night. They would build. They would fight. And one day they would cross the dark not as conquerors, but as friends to whatever waited on the other side. The silent destroyer turned its sensors toward Andromeda, listening to the hum of the black hole across the void. It was a song of power, and for the first time the galaxy sang back. The great refit began. It was a generational project. It required the dismantling of uninhabited moons, the harvesting of asteroid belts, the draining of gas giants. The Alliance became a singular organism focused on one goal, the bridge. Vor stood on the hull of the Hephaestus, now dry-docked in open space, serving as the keel for the new supership. He wore a pressure suit, looking out at the welding sparks that looked like new stars being born. He remembered the day he had laughed at the humans. He remembered the smell of the lavender and the feeling of superiority. It felt like a dream from a different life. Beside him, Vance floated, checking a datapad. You know, Vor said over the comms, my grandfather built the original Gorath ships. He used to say that a ship has a soul, that if you treat it well, it brings you home. Vance looked at the massive skeleton of the bridge ship taking shape. He was right, but souls can grow, they can change. What will we call this one? Vor asked, gesturing to the moon-sized construct. Vance looked at the structure. It was made of rusted parts, polished parts, alien alloys, and human steel. It was a Frankenstein's monster of hope. The Diplomat, Vance suggested. Vor snorted, too soft, it has guns the size of cities. The Peacemaker. Too ironic. Vance paused, how about the Rusty Bucket? Vor laughed, a sound that echoed in his helmet. Perfect, the UNS Rusty Bucket, the pride of the galaxy. They stood there for a long time, watching T. He construction. Two leaders of two different species, united by a scam that turned into salvation. They had looked into the abyss, and when the abyss looked back, they had sold it a warranty. The future was uncertain. The swarm was out there. The Andromedans were an enigma. But as the engines of the Rusty Bucket began their first test cycle, vibrating the very fabric of space-time, Vor knew one thing for certain. They would not kneel, not ever again. They would stand rusted and proud until the stars themselves burned out. The end,